This is Deep Dive. I'm Li Yingqi. The latest film of Chinese director Zhang Yimou appears to have made a notable impact on the country's judicial landscape. Both the Supreme People's Court and the Supreme People's Procuratorate have referenced this production, titled Article 20, in their annual work reports delivered to China's top legislature. Meanwhile, national lawmakers and political advisors have repeatedly highlighted the film as a positive example that raised public awareness regarding the complex legal clause that concerns every citizen. What were the issues from Article 20 that have resonated strongly with Chinese society? What does the film remind us about China's legislative progress? To delve into these questions, I spoke with my colleague Dou Hongyu. This episode is brought to you on Sunday, March the 17th. So, among these mentions by the top justice agencies, lawmakers, and political advisors, one phrase that frequently came up was that, I'm quoting and translating, law cannot yield to illegality.
Mm-hmm.
And Hongyu, you may need to first explain this quote to those who haven't seen this movie yet.
Well, this quote is actually a motto, but it's not a new motto. It was brought up by a German penologist in the 19th century, but it has reached more Chinese people because it is an iconic line in the movie Article 20. Article 20 is a clause in China's criminal law. It's about justifiable defense. The movie is about two prosecutors trying to clear the charges of a villager who killed a person who bullied him for months and repeatedly raped his wife. But it was not the villager's intention to kill. It happened when the bully was running back to the car to get a knife, and the villager was scared that he and his wife would be hurt and killed, so he picked up a pair of scissors and started stabbing him. And two of the stabs were fatal, so the bully died eventually. But the process of identifying it as a case of justifiable defense was quite difficult because first, the knife was hidden by a group of people who was trying to protect the bully. And the bully's family has the power to stop witnesses from providing more evidence. And on the other hand, most of the previous similar cases were identified as crimes. So many of the prosecutors in the movie thought it was not proper to apply the concept of justifiable defense to this case. And in the end, spoiler alert, the knife was found and the witnesses stood up to speak for the victim. In the end of the movie, during a hearing, one of the prosecutors made a speech in defense of the suspect. He argued that the law should be used to uphold social justice, not to wrongfully punish good people. And he said the law cannot yield to illegality. And in the end, the villager was set free. And this is how this motto was remembered by the Chinese audience.
Okay, let's talk more about this quote. Because if I'm not mistaken, this quote seems to have made it into the work report of the Supreme Procuratorate for 6 years in a row. And why did the Supreme Court decide to add this quote to its work report this year?
Well, I'm not 100% sure that there's a direct relationship between the movie, the quote, and the work report of the Supreme Court this year. But the movie did spark a heated discussion in the Chinese society because the Article 20, the justifiable defense, is so close to everybody, to every citizen with rights. But most of us are not quite clear about the details of the clause, such as the conditions and the consequences, the boundaries. Personally speaking, I learned this concept when I was about 12 or 13 years old at middle school. It was on the textbook. It's part of the compulsory education. We were told that we have the right to fight back and protect ourselves when our rights are violated. But we're also informed that there's a boundary, there's a line. If you do it excessively, you would also face criminal punishment, and you may end up in jail. People are curious about how they can use this right, and is it really true that the law is going to protect us if we hurt the person that is bullying us? The China's Supreme Court is overseen by the National People's Congress, which is China's top organ of state power. And the National People's Congress is composed of delegates from all across China, from all walks of life. So the heated discussion, the attention from the public also affects the work reports of China's Supreme Court.
Okay, so this quote and the work reports are all linking to this law article under the criminal law, Article 20. So what should we know about this article?
Well, the criminal law established the justifiable defense system in 1979. But back then, the clause was quite simple. It's just one item. It tells us the right of justifiable defense, but it's not quite specific. It was quite vague for China's judicial system. The policemen and the court, the procuratorate, were more prone to define such cases as criminal cases. And in the Chinese culture, people tend to be more sympathetic to the one that died. So if the defender killed the bully, the violator, they would end up in a very negative situation because people would show more empathy to the one who died. So the judicial system was more strict and harsh on the defenders. But the clause was improved in 1997, and it became the Article 20 that we're talking about right now. It made the boundary more clear. For example, in the old version, justifiable defense shouldn't exceed the limits of necessity causing a harm. But in the latest version, justifiable defense shouldn't apparently exceed the limits of necessity causing a serious harm. So you can see that the concept of justifiable defense has been widened. And it also added the right of boundless defense to this clause, even if the defense caused serious harms like heavy injuries or death of the infringer. If the defender did it when facing an immediate violent crime, seriously endangering the safety of life, the defense is also regarded as a justifiable act, and the defender will not bear criminal responsibility. So the law is showing more respect and consideration to human nature and human instinct. As a renowned Chinese professor of criminal law, Luo Xiang, once said, the conflicts in reality are not like what we see in video games, where you can see how much blood is left in the body of the rival and how much strength is in store. We cannot require the defenders to know how to fight properly. So I believe that the law is showing the right spirit in protecting the defenders.
And apparently this Article 20, this very important clause about our self-defense rights, is also known as the sleeping clause.
Yes.
And how did it earn this nickname?
Well, there is a gray zone because such cases are often quite complicated, and it's very difficult to collect enough evidence to prove that the act of the defender is a justifiable defense. So it always leads to controversial determinations. Since the process is always quite fast, even the passersby cannot figure out what is happening before the hurt happened. Sometimes there's even no witnesses, there's even no passersby. For example, if it happens in an isolated room, or if it happens in a remote field, and the infringer had been killed by the defender, who can stand up and speak for the defender, and what will be the material evidence? It requires more efforts from the police to collect such evidence. So if you look for academic papers related to justifiable defense, you would notice that it always comes with the word identification. So the difficulty in identifying a justifiable defense is a major challenge here. And on the other hand, there are not enough precedents. As we know, precedents are a major source of reference when dealing with such cases. In the past, the judicial organ was prone to determine such cases as criminal cases. And then there are still not enough precedents. So here is a vicious cycle. So the lack of evidence, the difficulties in collecting evidence, and the lack of previous similar cases are the major reasons why this clause is called a dormant clause.
And now there's clearly a lot of debate and discussion attention on this clause, including us recording an episode here. And this movie, Article 20, debuted in early February during the Chinese New Year, which was over a month ago. And then we began to see growing attention on this law article. Would you say the movie was the major factor that raised public awareness on this issue?
Absolutely. The movie is based on several typical cases in the past few years. The most high-profile case involved a driver and an e-bike rider. It happened in 2018 in Jiangsu province when a driver made a sudden turn and collided with an e-biker. It started with verbal dispute, but it escalated when the driver went back to the car and got a long knife and started wielding it at the e-biker. But he accidentally dropped the knife on the ground. The e-biker got the knife and in turn stabbed the driver to death. The biker was first in criminal detention, but the video of the whole process dominated the social media and people were arguing that the e-biker was not guilty because that should be considered as a justifiable defense or at least excessive defense. And just 5 days after the incident, the e-biker was freed from criminal responsibility, and the prosecutor who was in charge of this case won a national reward for taking the step of applying the concept of justifiable defense in dealing with the case. And since then, the prosecutors in several places across China have applied the justifiable defense clause. This incident is the case that has awakened this dormant clause. During the past few years, there are also several other cases that grabbed public attention. It can always spark a discussion on social media because people need a model of successful defenders because we can always see ourselves from the defenders. And people need to be affirmed that they are backed by law when they're faced with such violations and they want to fight back.
And now there's growing public awareness and also acknowledgement from the officials on this piece of law. Are we expecting amendments on this self-defense clause any time in the future?
We've heard a lot more voices after the movie. For example, a jurist from Beijing named Xing Long says, now it's time to specify the clause to make it more specific because when the self-defense clause is more specific, the gray zone will be smaller and it'll increase feasibility. It'll make it easier for the judicial organ to identify self-defense cases and make the right judgments. And there's also voices from the other law experts who say that there should be more guidelines and more public education about this clause. In fact, there's already such a guideline in 2020 when China issued the first legal guideline on self-defense. It provided a clearer definition of the term, and it outlined the conditions under which retaliatory actions should go unpunished. For example, we know that self-defense is only permitted during an unlawful infringement. If the violation has ended, and you decided to revenge, that is not considered as a justifiable defense.
Right.
So it's important to define the ending of such infringement. The document said if the defender had the wrong understanding of whether a legal infringement started or ended due to panic or nervousness, this should be handled with their subjective reasoning taken into account. As there are more discussions from the public, with more people using the right and with more cases of justifiable defense, I believe that the legislation will be improved. Some people believe that the clause and the guidelines are already clear enough, and the problem does not only lie in legislation, but mostly in jurisdiction. Just as the laws and the guidelines have taken people's nervousness into consideration, people argue that the police, the procuratorate, and the court should also put themselves into the shoes of the defenders, instead of just putting the defenders in the framework of logic. As a U.S. jurist, Oliver Wendell Holmes Jr. said, the life of the law has not been logic, it's been experience. So instead of taking a pure godlike perspective, they're expected to also imagine what an ordinary person can do during such emergencies. So I believe there's a lot to expect from both legislation and jurisdiction. As this article has been awakened, I believe that this will be an invisible armor for more and more victims and those who are willing to offer help. When they're faced with violation, they would believe that law cannot yield to illegality.
Okay, and this is a law that concerns each one of us. Thanks for joining.
Thank you.
Discussions surrounding the movie Article 20 are proving to be exceptionally educational for the public, as an increasing number of people are becoming acquainted with their self-defense rights, which they may not have been aware of previously. As for the judicial system, changes were already underway even before the movie's release. Between 2021 and 2023, the Supreme People's Court acquitted 77 individuals under the Self-Defense Clause. Meanwhile, the Supreme People's Procuratorate disapproved the arrests of 261 defendants last year alone, based on the same principle, marking a notable 25.5% increase from the preceding year. And that brings us to the end of this episode of Deep Dive. If you enjoyed what you just heard, don't forget to follow us on your podcast platform. Just search for Deep Dive. You can also leave comments to let us know what you want to learn about China and beyond. This episode is brought to you by me, Li Yunqi, and my colleagues Zhang and Qizhi. Special thanks to CGTN Radio reporter Dou Hongyu. I'll see you in the next one.